lot of people, right? It gets rid of a lot of those old-fashioned privileges and rights that different classes of people had. So he is preserving some aspects of the French Revolution that we talked about last week. But on the other hand, there's not really any sort of representative government. There's no check on his power, right? Because he can't be voted out of office. So he's preserving some aspects of the revolution while still maintaining his hold as a dictator, while also fighting all these wars. Y'all with me so far? Okay, so he's doing all that. He's never going to be satisfied. So is he going to be satisfied with the title First Consul for life? No. So in 1804, in December of 1804, he decides, you know what's better than First Consul for life? It's not king. We've already had a king of France, but that's not interesting. What's better would be if I were emperor. And he does this, and how do you think the people of France feel about this? They love it. But 15 years ago, 1789, they started a whole revolution because they didn't want a monarch. In 1793, 11 years before this, they executed their monarch. And now they have another monarch who has declared himself not just king, but emperor, which is higher than king. Right? But the people love it. He actually takes a vote, what's called a plebiscite, like basically a poll of all the people of France, not asking their permission, but just asking for their approval. And he says, do you approve of me calling myself emperor? And they overwhelmingly say yes. Yes, Napoleon, we love you. Do they not see what's happening? What do you think is happening here? Why do they approve so well, or so much, so overwhelmingly? They've just gone through 15 years of revolution to go back to having an emperor. Why are they okay with it?
They want to go through even more revolution.
Yeah, they're like, that revolution's been exhausting. Think of, they've been through the Reign of Terror, they've been at war with the entirety of Europe. Yeah, like stability for them is more important at this point than whether or not they have a constitution or whether or not they have a right to vote. Right? If you've grown up with nothing but revolution and not knowing what government you have year to year, maybe all you want is some stability. Right? So he asks the people, do you approve of me becoming emperor? And they say, yes, Napoleon, we love you. Kind of picture them with like star eyes, like yes, right? He has himself crowned emperor. Who's allowed to crown an emperor emperor? Like, who has the authority? The Pope. So he invites the Pope to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It's a very famous painting, also by David. He's like the personal artist for Napoleon. So same guy that painted both of these. He's just really good at it. Napoleon likes how well he's portrayed, right? So can y'all see this okay? This portrait, this painting is actually like the size of this entire wall and taller. I'd only ever seen it in a textbook, and then I went to the Louvre. I was looking for it, and I almost didn't see it because it was so dang big. Like you have to take a step back. So this next picture shows you the perspective. Like this is it on the wall there. These are people down here. So it's huge. All right. So where's Napoleon in this picture? He's the one holding up the crown. Okay, so this is Napoleon here. This is the moment where he's crowning his wife, Josephine. Right. He loved Josephine so much. He wrote these like beautiful letters to her. He loved Josephine. So he has her crowned empress, right? But the story goes, okay, so who is this then here? That's the Pope, right? So he invites the Pope to Notre Dame Cathedral. He's like, we're gonna have this big ceremony. You're gonna crown me emperor. And so the story goes, right? That the Pope starts to, make Napoleon kneel to take the crown. And Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope, puts it on his own head. He's saying, not even the Pope is above me. And so I feel like this is what, you can kind of understand his facial expression a little bit better. right? He's looking a little bit like, wah, wah. I don't know what the technical term for the wah wah feeling is, but I think that's what he's looking put out, right? Dismayed. That's better than wah wah. Right? He's looking dismayed because Napoleon has taken the crown from him and put it on his own head. He also has this ceremony on Christmas Day, 1804, which is obviously a very important day, but also reflective of 1,000 years before, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. So he's like, basically, I'm the next Charlemagne, I'm the next emperor of Europe. Right? Because Charlemagne was emperor of like basically all of Europe for a while. So he's drawing on Roman influences. You can see his kind of Roman-like toga action going on here. This is not the outfit of Louis. This is not the tights and high heels of Louis. Right? He's got this Roman outfit going on. His crown looks like the laurel wreaths, right, of the ancient world. So he's very much drawing on Roman influences. He's reminding people of Charlemagne. He's bringing up these images of empire and of returning France to some sort of glory, right? So he's building this French empire. He's building himself as an emperor, right? He's got this vision in mind. Go with me so far? Questions? So now we have an emperor and an empress of France. We haven't had one of those since Charlemagne, basically. So then he continues these wars, because this is no longer just about fighting off the Prussians and the Austrians, right? This is no longer about preserving the revolution in France, which was what the war started out as. This is about building an empire. So, France in 1799, right? Napoleon's additions by 1812 include this. The purple here, which is most of Germany, Italy, and then eventually Spain. The purple is, it says, states under Napoleon's control, so it's not actually directly part of France, but he says that they're like France's, what's the word? France is like subordinate states. Yeah, kind of like vassals. So what he does is he has a brother and a nephew that he puts, that he makes king of Spain and king of Italy. So they're like directly under his control. They're like these puppet governors of these regions. So he, even though it's not technically part of the French Empire at this point, it's part of the French Empire. It's just a technicality, right? So by 1812, he's got this, and he's at war with everything in orange. And then by the end of 1812, he forces everything in orange, which is Austria and Prussia, to not become part of his empire, but basically to surrender to him as an ally, a begrudging ally. So he's basically forced most of the continent into submission in 1812. Right? This is really impressive, because he was fighting some of the biggest armies in the world. This was Frederick the Great's army in Prussia. Right? These are some really big, powerful armies. Everywhere he's conquered, Spain, what had been the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, he introduces things like the Napoleonic Code. So in some ways, people are welcoming this, because it is an improvement in some ways from what they had before. But it's also a foreign invasion, right? So people have very mixed feelings about Napoleon here. All right, so you're Napoleon. It's 1812. You've conquered most of the continent, but your ambition is endless. What do you do next? Before you go to Russia, because Russia's big, what's your next goal? The British first, right? So he's like, and he also would have, he was kind of like on his way to Portugal. He had started to send an army to Portugal, so Portugal is going to be next too. And he looks to Great Britain, right? He's like, I can't claim to be emperor of all of Europe if I don't have Britain, okay? What's the problem with trying to conquer Britain? Water. So you need a navy. So he gathers up a navy, right? He's done all this so far with an army. He gathers up a navy, but who has the best navy in the world in 1812? The British do, right? This is, like, everybody knows this. And so he sends his navy to try to conquer Britain, and they defeat him soundly, destroy his navy. So he can't really conquer Britain. Keep this in mind when we get to World War II in a month or so, and Hitler has the same problem. Britain's an island, and that makes things complicated, right? So he can't conquer Britain. He tries to starve them out. He says, I control all of these people. I'm going to tell them they can't send any ships to Britain. They can't do any trade with Britain. Hitler's going to do the same thing in 200 years, right? So, 150 years. He tries to starve Britain out, and meanwhile he says, okay, while we're waiting on Britain to just surrender, where's he going to head next? Now he's going to head to Russia. And this is what we call hubris, right? Where your ambition and your pride exceed all reason. What's the problem with trying to invade Russia?
Large and cold.
Large and cold. You were saying, right? It's large and it's cold most of the year. Remember, Russia doesn't just stop here. If you could imagine the map continuing, Russia goes all the way to the dang Pacific Ocean, right? Russia's huge. So at what point can you say, I've conquered Russia, right? So he turns his attention to Russia. This is a bad idea. Hitler had the same idea. Right? You're gonna see some parallels like 1, 2, 3 when we get to the 20th century. So what you see here, he gets together an army made up of allies from Prussia, Austria, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, everybody.
Isn't his like role like how he got to like rise the reins to like control everybody? Isn't it kind of like Hitler? Germany was in a bad spot, so they said that Hitler.
There are some similarities. Like, I don't want to take it too far, but yeah, like they both take advantage of the fact that the economy is terrible and everything's going wrong, and people need a strong figure to. They think they need a strong figure to lead them. That's a good observation there. All right, so just making sure I'm sticking to my outline here. So he gets together in his army. He calls it his Grande Armée, which is French for Grand Army. This army is made up, as I said, of soldiers from every country that he controls, and has 600,000 soldiers. That's like the entirety of Nashville in one big army. And we haven't seen armies like this before, of that size. So he gets together one of the biggest armies the world has ever seen, his Grande Armée. And he starts heading towards Russia. But if you can read this, can anybody actually read this?
Invasion of Russia,
June 1812. So they leave friendly territory in June of 1812. It's summer. June's pretty warm still in Northern Europe. But an army of 600,000 takes an incredibly long amount of time to move, right? And how do you feed them? How do you keep them organized? How do you keep them supplied? These are all problems, right? And now Napoleon is pretty good about dealing with logistics like that. Like that's one of the things that has won him all the wars so far. But again, this is where his pride is the problem. Because he thinks, I've won literally every battle that I've had so far. I have the biggest army that anyone's ever seen. I'm gonna invade Russia, and what's Russia gonna do? Russia will send their army to defend their borders, and we'll face each other in battle and we'll win. That's what he's thinking. I don't know. Do you know what happens? Was that? Yeah, they basically say, okay, so we're not gonna fight you directly. Because we know if we fight you directly, we'll lose. So he's going into Russia, you know, with his army, 600,000, and the Russians are retreating. And and on the way, they're burning villages. Why are they burning their own villages? So Napoleon can't get them, and so Napoleon can't resupply. Because you can't take, 6 months worth of food for 600,000 people with you. You resupply on the way as you conquer new places. But all of those places are burnt to the ground. Because Russia, as we will see in World War II, does not care about their own people as long as they're winning the war. Right? Because what does Russia have in large supply? A lot of people. And they just look at them as expendable. Right? We're going to see this over and over again. So Russia, the army is basically drawing him in further. And he gets to Moscow, the capital, right? He's like, well, at least if I can take the capital, then I can claim I've taken Russia. I've won the battle. He gets to Moscow in October. Moscow in October is already covered in several feet of snow. Additionally, he gets to Moscow, and Moscow's been burnt to the ground. They burned their own capital to prevent Napoleon from taking it. So he gets there, and what does he do? What can you do? What options does he have? Can he declare victory? I mean, not really. He hasn't actually won a battle yet. He can't take the capital, but like the capital is not there. What choices does he have in October 1812? Turn back or keep going into, I don't know, Siberia? So he has to turn back. So this Grande Armée turns back in October 1812. But that means they have to go all of this distance, this is hundreds of miles, in the snow, in the cold, because October turns into November, and it just gets colder and colder and colder. It's a huge disaster. Of the 600,000 that left Prussian territory with the Grande Armée, and remember they only fought in small skirmishes, they never fought in like direct battle. But of those 600,000, any guesses? How many made it back? Less. Or I should say fewer. 20,000. I think that calculates to about 3% of his army makes it back. And they're not dying in battle, right? They've died of cold, exposure, of disease, of starvation. It's absolutely miserable. We have some journal entries from this journey to Russia and back. So this is Napoleon, looking very defeated. The soldiers reported eating their horses, having to steal boots and cloaks off of their dead comrades so that they don't die of hypothermia. It's miserable. So the Grande Armée is defeated. They limp their way back to Paris, and you can imagine like the crowds in Paris are like, where's the rest of you? Is this the end for Napoleon? No. It's not the end for Napoleon. Remember, so he's had this huge defeat, his Grand Armée is decimated, but he, again, has this outsized pride, outsized ambition, and nevertheless, despite everything, his army still supports him. At least the French part of the army does. But after this, the rest of Europe sees an opportunity because the Grande Armée has been decimated. Basically, it's Britain who's been left fighting, and Prussia and Austria have been forced into submission. So they see an opportunity to finally face Napoleon once and for all. Because they're like, his army is gone. If we're going to ever defeat Napoleon, now's the chance. So in 1814, it takes them a while to get organized because it's 200 years ago. But by 1814, Great Britain, Prussia, and Austria pull their troops together, get themselves organized, and decide that this is the moment to take on Napoleon once and for all. So they face Napoleon, sorry, I said 1813, they face Napoleon at Leipzig, which is also called the Battle of Nations because of all the different nations involved. So the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, 1813. They defeat Napoleon. Chance.
You said Britain, Russia,
Austria. So the orange countries here, Great Britain. They defeat Napoleon, right? Because he hasn't had a chance to rebuild his army, right? But what do we do with Napoleon? They take him, they capture him, right? What do you do with Napoleon? This guy that's been fighting all of Europe for 2 decades almost. What do we do with him? You would think, right? You would think like, oh, we've captured their king, we're gonna kill him. They don't execute Napoleon. Why not?
Mark Theresa. They'll kill him or French will make it.
Oh, Mark, okay, sorry. I just didn't understand those as a word. Yeah, they don't want the French to have a martyr. They also, okay, so they're the kings of other countries. They don't want to set the precedent of it's okay to kill the king of a different country, right? Because that sounds kind of like revolution. Right, so they don't want to set that precedent. So what do? You gotta get rid of him. What do? They exile him, and they send him to this little tiny island here called Elba, which is spelled like this. Elba has a population of like 10,000, so like the size of Martin, Tennessee, right? And they say, okay, Napoleon, you lost the war, so you don't get your empire anymore, but you can go be governor of Elba, and just stay there. Is he going to be happy with that? So they put him on Elba, and they're like, stay there. And the rest of Europe is like, okay, crap, we've been fighting Napoleon for like 20 years. How do we get ourselves back together again? So they start to meet. They start to have plans. They're like, okay, well, who's in charge of the French now? Who is in charge of the French now? Not that they're long gone. So what you said, what happened to his wife? He divorced Josephine, who he loved so much, because she couldn't have children, and he married another princess from the Austrian family, I think, Maria somebody, and she gave him children. I hate that she gave him. So it's not Napoleon's family. The powers that be in Europe start to say, okay, well, what we need to do is pretend like this revolution thing never happened. We need to go back to time of stability. We need to go back to 1789, before all this started. But Louis XVI is dead, right? They cut off his head. So they give the throne of France to his brother, who comes to the throne as Louis XVIII. What happened to Louis XVII? That was Louis XVI's son, who then died before anything ever happened. So his younger brother is now Louis XVIII. And the people of France are kind of like, what? The Louis again? This guy again? Like, this is the same family that we fought this revolution against? They're not super thrilled with this. And Napoleon's down here on Elba. So, like, Europe is basically catching his breath from this 20-year war. And then Napoleon decides, you know what, I'm kind of sick of being governor of Elba. I've been here for a couple months. And so he escapes. It's not that far to take a little boat from Elba to southern France. And he arrives with a small group of soldiers that were like supposed to, be like the little soldiers in Elba. He lands in southern France. What does Louis XVIII do? He's supposed to be king. Well, he sends the army to go get him, right? He sends the army, so he's up in Paris, he sends the army down south to go get him. The army, who has always loved Napoleon, sees Napoleon. Napoleon's like, my army, my soldiers. And they're like, right on, Napoleon, and they switch sides. Now, supposedly, this is another supposedly, Louis sends another troop to go get him, and they also switch sides. And supposedly, this one's a big supposedly, Napoleon at this point writes to Louis and says, no need to send more troops, I have enough. And they march to Paris. Louis flees. He's like, oh crap, I can't face Napoleon. And Napoleon's like, I'm back! The French Revolution is back! The empire is back! I'm your emperor again! And what does the rest of Europe do? They're like, oh, no. We're not letting this get started again. And they round up the troops that they had just had less than a year before in the Battle of Leipzig. And they meet Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. On my birthday, 1815, June 1815. They say, we're not letting this get started again. We just sat down to like figure out what to do with all these governments that he wrecked. And they defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. 1815. He was back in power for 100 days. It's called Napoleon's 100 days, right? It's like his last hurrah. And his Waterloo is, when you say something's your Waterloo, that's your final defeat. So now what do they do with Napoleon? They exile him again! But they're smarter about it this time. They're not going to send him to Elba. Where do they send him? To the island of St. Helena. This is South America. This is Africa. This is the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic. No one was living there. It's just like a rock that the British had claimed in their explorations. And they're like, that's a great rock to go send Napoleon to. And they send him to St. Helena, guarded by British troops this time, where he will die a few years later. Probably stomach cancer, which led a lot of people to think, oh, he was poisoned. But he probably wasn't. Now, we're finally done with Napoleon. But we have to go from this to like stability again. We have to decide where the empires are, where the states are, who's in charge. Because Napoleon has basically kicked a lot of kings and queens off their thrones and installed his own family, right? He made his brother the king of Spain and his nephew the king of Italy, or vice versa, doesn't matter, right? So how are we going to put Europe back together again? So the ruling powers of Europe meet in Vienna, which is the capital of Austria. I don't have it on here. And they meet at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And this is where they decide, okay, we're going to turn back the clock. We're going to pretend like none of this ever happened. We're going to go back to pre-1789. Louis XVIII, you're back again in France. The former nobility of Italy, of Spain, of Germany, as much as we can, we're going to put you back on your thrones. And we're going to pretend like this whole revolution thing never really happened. But you can't. Right? You can't pretend like none of this ever happened. And the French don't want to pretend like none of this ever happened. They're going to take a minute to breathe. They're going to deal with Louis XVIII. And Louis XVIII is going to walk very carefully. He's got to be walking on eggshells because they executed his big brother. Right? So he knows he has to be very careful and not piss off the French. And the rest of Europe is definitely on eggshells too, as they're like, okay, we don't want this revolution thing to get started again. But it's going to get started again, as we'll see in a couple weeks. It's going to get started again and again and again. And the French are going to have revolutions again and again and again. But this is the one that was called the French Revolution. So when we talk about the French Revolution, we're talking about the one that starts in 1789 and ends up a failure. Because after all of that, they end up with Louis XVIII back on the throne. They don't end up with a lot of more rights than they had before. And they've been at war for 20 years, unsuccessfully in the end. I would call that a success. All right, questions? All right, so we'll see how this connects to the Haitian Revolution on Wednesday.